So, the Gothenburg Post recently published an article titled Five Myths About the Sweden Democrats and Immigration. Why one of Sweden's largest newspapers have chosen this specific time to publish yet another article about the virtues of Muslim immigration is of course no secret. Not only are the Sweden Democrats skyrocketing in the polls, but public perception towards both immigration, the EU, and the media is getting worse and worse. And with the recent migrant crisis from Syria, something needs to be done to keep immigration high and to convince the Swedish people that there are no problems with the current immigration policies, and that anyone who says otherwise is a racist idiot. The article in question was written by a man called Henrik Arnstad. I won't go into detail about who Henrik Arnstad is or why it's so insulting to my intelligence to see an article by him in a major newspaper. Maybe in a future video. But in short, Henrik Arnstad is presented by the media and claims himself to be a historian, despite having no academic credentials at all. He also has close ties to violent communist groups. So in short, Henrik Arnstad is not a scholar of any kind. He is a deluded liar who is referred to by the media as an expert because he says what they want him to say. I have taken the time to translate the article in its entirety to show what a typical propaganda piece in the Swedish newspaper can look like. I will read the excerpts from the article in Henrik Arnstad's characteristically high-pitched voice. The problem with guesses is that they often are repeated by other opinion makers and go from being free thoughts to becoming myths to becoming commonly accepted truths, says Henrik Arnstad, and uses research to crush 5 myths about the Sweden Democrats, Sweden, and immigration. Notice how they claim that the article is based on research, but, as we are about to find out, Arnstad is very bad at citing sources, instead presenting blatant lies and wishful thinking as academic consensus. In the trace of the success of the Sweden Democrats comes an unavoidable question about why they're so successful, how they can be stopped, and most important of all, how large can they grow? This guessing game should be done more often next to existing research. In many ways, we don't have to guess. We know, based on existing research, if we want to know. This rhetoric is common among the Swedish media. The growth of the Sweden Democrats is presented as something negative and horrible that needs to be stopped. It shows the astounding contempt the journalists have for the Swedish people when they constantly do everything in their power, including lie and harass, to sabotage the Sweden Democrats' success and keep immigration as high as possible. If the Swedish media had done their job and reported on crime committed by immigrants instead of ignoring it and covering it up, then perhaps they would be able to speak openly about why the Sweden Democrats are growing, instead of pretending that this is some baffling, unsolvable mystery. The Sweden Democrats are growing because people feel that immigration is too high and no other party is willing to reduce immigration. It's that simple. I have spent the summer reading up on the research around the questions around these common myths. Here are some of the results. I highly doubt Henrik Arnstad has done any studying or research. If he had done his research, he would be able to cite his fucking sources. Myth number one. Sweden's relatively large intake of refugees is important in explaining the Sweden Democrats' success. If we were to take in less refugees, then the Swedes would become less worried, racism would decrease, and with that the potential support for the Sweden Democrats. Notice his use of words. What he's trying to debunk is my earlier statement that the Sweden Democrats are gaining support because more and more people want to reduce immigration, but he phrases it entirely differently. Instead of using the word immigrants, he uses the word refugees, because refugees has a much less negative connotation. Even though most of the Muslim immigrants in Sweden don't have refugee status and are only coming here for economic reasons. He is trying to trick the reader into thinking that most of the Muslim immigrants are refugees, which is simply not true. I also want to point out this line. Racism would decrease, and with that the potential support for the Sweden Democrats. Once again, the media is labeling the people who support Sweden Democrats as racists in order to shame them from voicing their opinions. In reality, the opposite seems to be true. Attitudes towards immigration and immigrants is more positive when the concentration of immigrants is high. In some ways he's right. Obviously the immigrants themselves are very positive towards Sweden's immigration policies, so in the areas where only immigrants live, the attitude towards immigration is probably pretty good. However, statistics from the latest election show that the Sweden Democrats have their highest support in areas of Sweden with a lot of immigrants, especially majority Swedish municipalities that border municipalities with high number of immigrants. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Sweden Democrats have their highest support in Scania, where most immigrants live. The best way to reduce racism would, in that case, be to keep immigration high, or maybe even increase it. The more foreigners that exist in a society, the bigger the chance that they interact with the natives, and these interactions lead to personal relations, which reduces racism. As I said previously, the case seems to be the total opposite. The more contact the Swedish population has with Muslim immigrants, the more likely they are to vote for the Sweden Democrats. In Henrik Arnstads world, the only people who would vote for the Sweden Democrats are idiot racists who've never met a Muslim and thus doesn't understand how great they are. He and the rest of the media continually dismisses people's genuine anger and concern over the direction of Sweden and Swedish immigration policies as nothing more than the irrelevant ramblings of a bunch of segregated idiots, when in reality they are the ones who are segregated idiots. Henrik Arnstad, along with almost all journalists, live in Södermalm, one of the richest and most whitest areas of Stockholm. Why don't they take their own advice and move out to Rinkeby or Husby with all the Somalis? They want everyone else to embrace multiculturalism and mass immigration, while they themselves move as far away as possible and spend all their time in their ethnically Swedish enclaves. They are hypocrites! Above all, it would be the wrong way to go, to reduce the intake of refugees, once again using the term refugees instead of immigrants, not only for humanitarian reasons, and probably also economically, but also politically for racist parties like the Sweden Democrats. Reducing immigration would not be a bad idea economically. Estimates on what the Swedish government spends per year on immigration range from 4.5 billion euros to 25 billion euros. Even if we go by the lowest estimates that say that Sweden is only making a net loss of 4.5 billion euros per year on immigration, that's still a loss of 4.5 billion a year. How can anyone claim that Sweden is gaining economically on immigration when none of the estimates suggest that they're even breaking even? Also note that he once again refers to the Sweden Democrats as a racist party. Another well-known example is the hatred of the Jews in Nazi Germany, which led to the Holocaust, even though the number of Jews in Germany in 1933 were less than 1% of the population. First, Godwin's law. Secondly, Henrik Arnstad proves why he shouldn't be taken seriously as a scholar of history when he boils down the complex and complicated historical reasons that eventually led to the Holocaust to there were too few Jews in Germany. Myth number 2. Those who vote for racist parties cannot be categorized as racist. Often it's more about protest votes against the establishment or insecurities in times of economic crisis. Research shows that most of the people who vote for racist parties do so for the same reasons that people vote for every other party. The voters agree with their politics, in this case specifically racism. Once again trying to smear the Sweden Democrats and its voters as nothing more than racists. And yet we keep attributing other factors to why people vote for the Sweden Democrats, like their working class with little education who are among the losers of modern society. This is a narrative that the media and politicians have kept spinning since 2006. The people who vote for the Sweden Democrats are supposedly uneducated, working class who don't understand what they're doing. Is there anything more patronizing? And it also, ironically, shows the class hate of the modern Swedish left wing. They deride and discredit the Sweden Democrats as poor and uneducated racists, the implication being that being poor and working class and lacking higher education is something negative and something to be shamed for. Yes, the left wing, who started as a movement who stood up for the poor and working class, have now gone full circle into being an elitist, snobby cult, no better than the lords and kings and factory workers they rebelled against originally. Fucking beautiful. This thought is not without merit. Yes, it is. All your thoughts are without merit, Henrik Arnstad. There is an overrepresentation of such men among the voters of racist parties, but it is very small, less than 10%. Giving numbers and statistics without sources. Also, you can't really know who votes for which party in Sweden, since voting in elections is anonymous. Nobody knows which party you voted for except yourself. So how can Henrik Arnstad know how many men or women voted for the Sweden Democrats? He can't. Another thought is that those who vote for racist parties are doing so as a protest. They want to disrupt the status quo and shock the political elite. This is true inasmuch as those who vote for racist parties often have low trust of the political system. Again, he can't know this. But I would probably agree inasmuch as the people who vote for the Sweden Democrats probably have low trust of the media and politicians, seeing as Sweden Democrats are constantly mocked, ridiculed, disregarded and harassed by the media. But again, voters for the Sweden Democrats are not the same as racists, no matter how much Henrik Arnstad wants you to think otherwise. But this doesn't mean that the racist voters don't know what they are voting for. On the contrary, according to research. What research? Myth number 3.
Sweden was, until recently, an ethnically homogeneous country. The immigration of recent years means something totally new and multicultural that the Swedish people have a hard time handling. We must dare to start discuss this.
This isn't a myth. Sweden was, until 25 or so years ago, an ethnically homogeneous country. Sweden has had historically very little immigration, and it was only in 1991, when the Lucia law that heavily regulated immigration to Sweden was repealed, that this onslaught of immigration started. So yes, up until 1991, Sweden was very ethnically homogeneous.
What sets Sweden apart since decades is the total opposite. Sweden took in an enormous amount of refugees during World War II, at the same time as our neighboring countries produced refugees. This in many ways remained after the war, when Sweden took in large amounts of refugees, immigrants, and workers from large parts of the world.
What he's saying is once again a total lie. Sweden did take in a lot of refugees from Finland during World War II. This was done in collaboration with the Finnish government and was understood by both countries to be temporary. And, just as planned, as soon as the war ended, all the Finns were sent home again. This is nothing like the immigration of today, where Somalis and Syrians come here to leech off of our welfare system with no intention of ever going back home or becoming a productive member of Swedish society. And to say that Sweden took in a large amount of refugees after the war is also a blatant lie. The extradition of the Balts, anyone? Henrik Arnstad is revising history in order to further his own political agenda. Sweden has never been a multicultural bastion of tolerance, and judging by the Swedish people's growing negative attitudes towards immigration, probably won't be in the future either.
The opposition have always said that the current immigration wave was something totally new compared to previous immigration. This because immigrants generally, after experiencing a tough introductory period, found themselves at home in Swedish society. When the opposition is forced to claim that the new immigrants are something fundamentally different than before.
The current immigration is something totally different than immigration of the past, due to the sheer volume of immigrants. Sweden has no way of accommodating an immigration wave of about 1% of the total population every year. Also, the current immigration is primarily from Muslim countries, with values and histories that are vastly different from Swedish society. Muslim ideas of Sharia law, hijab, and restrictions of freedom of speech are fundamentally incompatible with Swedish society, which means that 100,000 Muslim immigrants every year is going to change the cultural landscape of Sweden much more than 100,000 Norwegian immigrants per year.
Today it is often claimed that refugees from the Middle East will take their conflicts with them to Sweden, an argument that was raised when people from the former Yugoslavia came to Sweden during the early 90s. People said that there would be a civil war between Croatians, Serbs, and Bosnians. This didn't happen, however.
Immigration from Yugoslavia was much lower than the immigration from the Middle East is today, and we can see that violence and crime has skyrocketed in the past years. And crime is much higher in immigrant-heavy areas than in ethnically Swedish areas. In Gothenburg and Malmö, we have daily reports of shootings and bombings, almost always in immigrant-heavy areas. Even if the immigrants aren't bringing the conflict with them, they are, at the very least, creating new ones.
Myth number 4. Sweden's failed integration politics.
This is another narrative that the media and politicians love to spin. The problem isn't immigration, see? It's integration. If we could just get better at integrating the immigrants, then we wouldn't have so high crime statistics among immigrants. First of all, they are yet again using the wrong terminology. Sweden shouldn't be integrating any immigrants. What we should be doing is assimilate. Integration means that immigrants and Swedes coexist side by side. Assimilation means that the immigrants become a part of Swedish society. We shouldn't have to adjust ourselves to another culture. We were here first. We have lived here for thousands of years. If they want to come here, they should adapt.
It's an often repeated phrase that Sweden's failed integration policy is a veritable fact. But this summer, an international study, Migrant Integration Policy Index, was presented to show the complete opposite. According to this study, Sweden has, by a wide margin, the best immigration politics in Europe, which shouldn't surprise since Sweden has decades of experience. According to this study, Sweden tops the list in almost all statistically compared areas, including discrimination, job market, and family reunions.
Here Henrik Arnstad is showing us exactly what a slimy, contemptible propagandist he truly is. He takes a study, filters the findings through his own political lens, and then presents his interpretation as fact. Anyone should be suspicious by his choice of words. Sweden has, by a wide margin, the best immigration politics in Europe. How do you quantify something as being the best? Best in what way? According to whom? If we actually read the study he cites, we can see that the study doesn't say anything about how successful Sweden is in integrating immigrants. The study merely shows how much each country spends on immigration, with Sweden of course being the clear leader since our politicians is nothing if not willing to hand everything we have over to foreigners. So we have a study that says that Sweden spends the most money of all countries in Europe on immigration efforts. But according to Henrik Arnstad, that means that Sweden has the best integration politics. If you spend billions with nothing to show for it, you haven't spent your money well, and your policies have failed, and your politics are probably not very good.
Myth number 5. Sweden has become a racist country.
Is this a myth? I haven't heard anyone say that Sweden has suddenly become racist. What is he talking about? Probably this so-called myth is just an excuse for him to explain why Sweden is so great and tolerant and to shame people who are anti-immigration to keep quiet and not step out of line.
The EU's latest statistics over its members came this July, and it shows that Sweden is radically different than the rest of the EU in its views on immigration from outside of Europe. Generally, about 34% of people in the EU are positive to immigration from outside of Europe, while 56% is negative. But the report specifically mentions Sweden. Sweden stands out as being the only country where the large majority of the population take a positive view of the immigration of people from outside the EU. 66% of total positive versus 31%.
This may very well be true, but we have to remember that the propaganda for immigration is everywhere in Sweden, and that those who speak up against it oftentimes face serious real-life consequences. As such, you should always be skeptical about any study that claims that Sweden is positive towards immigration, in much the same way you should be skeptical about any study that says the majority of North Koreans are supportive of Kim Jong-un. Furthermore, the same study that Henrik Arnstad points to claims that 48% of Swedes view immigration as the most important issue right now. Wouldn't that mean that the number of people negative to immigration should be higher? There's also the problem with what exactly the numbers say. Henrik Arnstad is using the numbers to prove that Sweden is supportive of the current immigration policies, when in reality all the numbers say is that 66% of the people asked were positive about immigration from outside the EU, not Europe as Henrik Arnstad claims. That doesn't mean that people agree with the current policies or that they don't want to reduce immigration. I mean, Norway is outside of the EU, so if I'm positive to someone from Norway moving to Sweden, does that mean that I, according to Henrik Arnstad's logic, support the current policies?
These numbers show why the debate is so polarized in Sweden, as opposed to our neighboring countries, where the view on immigration is much more negative. In Sweden, the anti-racist ideology is still very much alive, fighting and publicly supported.
No, the debate is so polarized in Sweden because anyone who doesn't agree with the government and the media is harassed and vilified.
These numbers are also a possible explanation to why the Swedish racist party is much more radical than its Nordic counterparts.
The idea that the Sweden Democrats are somehow more extreme than any other anti-immigration party is something that started cropping up in the media as a way of justifying the witch hunts on Sweden Democrats, while parties with the same opinions were treated as legitimate in Norway, Finland, and Denmark. It is complete bullshit. The Sweden Democrats' policies are hardly extreme in an international context.
In contrast to other similar parties, the Sweden Democrats sprung from Sweden's darkest black-brown history and is still characterized by fascist ideologies, according to a study done by me.
According to a study done by me. According to a study done by me! My private research shows that the Sweden Democrats are extreme racist fascists. Why should anyone trust you? Not only do you cite yourself as a source instead of a third party, which might have given your asinine statements more credibility, but this mystical study of yours isn't even named or anything. What study are you talking about? Where was it published? Has it been peer reviewed? Where can I find it and read this study for myself? Furthermore, Henrik Arnstad doesn't have a degree, so any study he has done automatically holds no credibility. He's not a historian, he's not a scholar, he's just some guy. Any academic findings he claims to have made should be instantly dismissed.
The strong popular support for democracy and anti-racism does not, however, mean that we are secure from further political success from the Sweden Democrats.
More referring to the Sweden Democrats as racists.
There are 31% who are negative to immigration from outside Europe, which means that the Sweden Democrats have good potential for growth.
Well, I agree that the party has a good potential for growth.
The party has already broken through the current ceiling for racist parties, which tends to be around 15%.
Is that resealing some documented fact, or did you just pull that out of your ass? Furthermore, if there is such a thing as a ceiling for racist parties, then perhaps the fact that the Sweden Democrats have broken through it indicate that they are not racist? Just a thought.
Racism is politics.
What?
And like all politics, it can convince people outside of the already convinced. Adolf Hitler didn't reach power by his hatred of Jews, but by focusing on other questions, like social issues.
Henrik Arnstad loses by default for invoking Godwin's law. Again. Secondly, what does he want to say here? That we should be wary of the Sweden Democrats precisely because they aren't acting like fascists? Is it merely a ruse to trick the voters into thinking they are harmless, and then as soon as they get into power, they will start an ethnic genocide? As ridiculous as that sounds, that is probably precisely what he thinks. I mean, he has gone on record saying that the fact that the Sweden Democrats aren't acting like fascists, it was proof that they are fascists. The man is deluded, and the fact that he is presented in the media as an expert is sickening.
Conclusions.
Finally.
What I've said above is based on science.
Bullshit!
Which doesn't mean that these perceptions are unchallenged or constitutes hard truths.
Well, we can finally wholeheartedly agree on something, Henrik. None of what you have said in this article constitutes hard truth. In fact, a lot of it constitutes blatant lies and misinformation.
Science isn't science, but questioning and debate.
Well, in a way that's true, but that doesn't mean that all questions are equally valid. What Henrik Arnstad is trying to do is preemptively legitimizing his pseudo-scientific ramblings as real science. This means that every critique of him by legitimate scholars can be simply waved off as academic disagreement. This isn't the first time he has done this. A couple of years ago, he wrote a book where he basically accused the entirety of the Finnish people of being active party in the Holocaust. When he then was debunked and called an idiot by legitimate scholars, he spun it around and said that his influential work had sparked enormous scientific debate.
Still, the research shows important and relevant views that deserve more attention as opposed to the freely tossed opinions that too often make up the foundation of public discourse.
What the public debate on immigration needs more is facts, hard numbers, and reliable statistics presented unbiasedly, not Henrik Arnstad's moronic ramblings.
To build the debate upon a foundation of knowledge has proved to be a documented way to combat the political triumph of racism.
And here it is laid clear exactly what the media's goal is: to combat racism. Racism being the Sweden Democrats, obviously. The media shouldn't try to combat any political movement. All it should do is present the news factually, without bias, and without cover-ups. Something the Swedish media is depressingly bad at.
Because it is racism that is the big threat to our country, our social safety net, and our society, not the manageable challenges of immigration.
How is racism a big threat? Henrik Arnstad hasn't explained at all why we should be so afraid of racism. All he has done is tried and failed to show how Swedish immigration is a huge success instead of a massive failure. The big threat to our country and society is not racism, but people like Henrik Arnstad, who lie, shame, brainwash and harass people into not questioning the actions of our government. Fuck you, Henrik Arnstad, for lying to the Swedish population about the most important political issue of our times. Fuck you, Gothenburg Post, for giving this man a platform. And fuck the entire establishment for continuing to push Sweden further toward financial and cultural collapse.